On a quiet Sunday night in August of 1989, two brothers stood over the bodies of their parents, having fired 15 rounds in a matter of seconds. But when the police arrived, they didn't find a robbery gone wrong. They didn't find a gang execution. They found two young men, sobbing on the lawn, waiting for the world to believe a lie. The media called them spoiled monsters. The prosecution called them cold-blooded opportunists. But underneath the millions of dollars, underneath the tennis tournaments, the acting lessons, the Beverly Hills address, there was a secret so dark, so long buried, the brothers later said they would rather spend the rest of their lives in a cage than keep it hidden one more day. The police spent months looking for the motive in the bank accounts. But the real motive wasn't in the money. It was in the walls of that house. And tonight we are going inside to understand what happened on the night of August 20th, 1989. You have to first understand what it looked like to be a Menendez. From the outside, the picture was immaculate. Jose Menendez had arrived in the United States from Cuba in the early 1960s with almost nothing. Through sheer force of will, he had built himself into one of the most powerful entertainment executives in the country. By the late 1980s, he was the CEO of Live Entertainment, a major video distribution company, earning millions of dollars a year. His wife, Kitty, was by his side for all of it. Polished, social, devoted to her family in the way that people who have worked hard for everything tend to be. They lived in a $2.6 million mansion in Beverly Hills. Their two sons, Lyle, 21, and Erik, 18, drove expensive cars, wore expensive clothes, played competitive tennis, talked about careers in entertainment and professional sports. To everyone who looked in from outside, this was an American success story. A family that had everything. And that is exactly what made what came next so difficult for the world to process. Because the family that had everything was hiding something that cannot be measured in dollars. It was a Sunday night. Jose and Kitty Menendez were in the family room of their Beverly Hills home, watching a movie. Lyle and Erik had told their parents they were going out. They went to a movie theater, bought tickets, established their alibi, then came back. They entered through the back of the house. What happened next took less than 1 minute. Investigators would later count 15 shotgun shell casings in that room. Jose Menendez was killed where he sat. Kitty Menendez tried to flee. She was shot multiple times. She was shot again at close range. The forensic details are not the point of this story. The point is the aftermath. Because when Lyle and Erik Menendez drove away from that house and called 911 at 11:47 p.m., their voices were breaking. They told the dispatcher they had come home to find their parents shot. They were hysterical by the time officers arrived. And for the next 6 months, that is exactly what the world saw. Two grieving sons. At the funeral, they wept openly. In the weeks that followed, they spent their parents' money on trips, on clothes, on tennis coaches, on a Porsche. To the prosecution, that spending would later become the centerpiece of their case. These boys killed for the inheritance. It was a clean, logical narrative. It was also, the defense would argue, catastrophically incomplete. For the first 6 months after the murders, Lyle and Erik Menendez were not suspects. They were victims. The initial theory was that Jose Menendez, given the nature of the entertainment business, had been targeted by organized crime. He had enemies. He had made deals that went badly. There were people who might have wanted him gone. Detectives followed those threads. They all went cold. Meanwhile, Erik Menendez was unraveling. He had begun seeing a therapist, a psychologist named Dr. Jerome Oziel, in the months after the murders. And in October of 1989, Erik told Dr. Oziel something that changed everything. He and Lyle had done it. Dr. Oziel, believing he was now at personal risk from the brothers, told his girlfriend what he had heard. His girlfriend, Judalon Smith, eventually went to the police. In March of 1990, 7 months after the murders, investigators raided Dr. Oziel's office and seized the therapy tapes. The tapes contained Erik's confession. In April of 1990, Lyle Menendez was arrested at his home. Erik Menendez turned himself in days later. The case the prosecution believed they had was simple. Two greedy sons, impatient for a $14 million inheritance, had executed their parents and then put on the performance of their lives. But then the brothers spoke. Take a breath here, because this is the part of the story that split the country in half. When Lyle and Erik Menendez finally took the stand, in a trial that was televised and watched by millions of people, they did not claim innocence. They admitted they pulled the triggers. What they claimed was why. And what they described, in testimony that lasted days, was a childhood that bore no resemblance to the one the world thought they had lived. Behind the Beverly Hills mansion, behind the tennis tournaments, behind the image of the perfect American family, they described years of sexual and psychological abuse at the hands of their father. Beginning, Erik testified when he was a young child. They described a father who controlled every aspect of their lives through fear, who used the family's wealth and his own dominance as tools of total control, who silenced them with threats so effective that neither boy had told a single person, not a teacher, not a friend, not a relative, for years. They described a mother who knew or suspected and who said nothing, not because she didn't love her sons, but because she was afraid of him too. This testimony stopped the courtroom. Prosecutors attacked it as fabricated, as a story invented by two young men and their defense attorneys to escape responsibility for cold-blooded murder. The defense argued it was the truth that had been locked inside that house for decades, and that the night of August 20th was not the act of greed. It was, they said, the act of two boys who had finally become convinced that their father was going to kill them before they could kill him. Fear, not greed. Terror, not inheritance. The first trial of Lyle and Erik Menendez began in 1993. The brothers were tried separately before the same judge, with juries that did not overlap. For months, the country watched. The testimony was deeply uncomfortable, not because it was graphic, but because it forced every person watching to ask a question that had no easy answer. If what these brothers are saying is true, does it change anything? Both juries deadlocked. They could not reach a unanimous verdict. Some jurors believed the brothers. Some did not. Some believed the abuse but believed the killing was still not legally justified. The judge declared a mistrial. The prosecution moved forward with a second trial. This time, things were different. The judge in the second trial made a critical ruling. The abuse testimony would be significantly limited. The defense would not be allowed to present the full scope of what the brothers had described in the first trial. Without that testimony, the framing of the case shifted. The jury in the second trial convicted both brothers of first-degree murder. In 1996, Lyle and Erik Menendez were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. They were in their mid-20s. The case appeared to be closed. But the story was not over. For nearly 3 decades, the Menendez case lived in a particular place in American culture. It was shorthand for excess, for entitlement, for the dark side of wealth. The brothers became, in the cultural imagination, a cautionary tale about two spoiled young men who had committed the ultimate crime and tried to lie their way out of it. But something was shifting slowly, quietly, in the years that followed. New voices emerged. Researchers and advocates working in the field of childhood trauma and sexual abuse began to re-examine the case through a different lens. One that, in 1996, had not yet fully entered the mainstream conversation. The understanding of how childhood abuse shapes behavior, how it creates terror, dissociation, hypervigilance, and in extreme cases, violent responses to perceived threat, had advanced significantly in the decades since the first trial. And the Menendez brothers' testimony, reviewed through that lens, looked different. In 2023, a new development broke through the silence. A fellow inmate of Erik Menendez, Roy Rossello, a former member of the Latin boy band Menudo, came forward publicly. He stated that Jose Menendez had sexually abused him when Rossello was a minor in the 1980s. It was an independent allegation, from someone with no legal incentive to make it, about the same man, from the same era. The Los Angeles district attorney at the time, George Gascon, ordered a review of the case. In October 2023, he filed a motion to re-sentence the brothers, arguing that the original sentencing had not adequately accounted for the abuse they suffered, and that decades of rehabilitation in prison warranted reconsideration. The case that had seemed closed for 30 years was open again. In November of 2024, 35 years after the night that changed everything, a Los Angeles judge resentenced Lyle and Erik Menendez. Their sentences were reduced. They were made eligible for parole. The decision was not a declaration of innocence. It was not an erasure of what happened on August 20th, 1989. It was an acknowledgement, formal, legal, and long overdue, that the full story of what happened in that house had never truly been heard. The parole board process as of 2025 is ongoing. California Governor Gavin Newsom requested additional psychological evaluations before making a final determination on whether the brothers would be released. Lyle Menendez is in his mid-50s. Erik Menendez is in his early 50s. They have spent more of their lives inside a prison than they ever spent inside that house in Beverly Hills. Here is what experts who have studied this case for decades want us to understand. When a child is abused by a parent, especially a parent who is also powerful, wealthy, and respected in the outside world, the abuse is almost impossible to report. Because who would believe it? The father with the mansion. The father with the CEO title. The father who coached his son's tennis games and showed up to their school events. That father? And so the child learns to carry it alone. They learn to perform normalcy because normalcy is survival. They smile at the right moments. They win trophies. They drive the expensive car. And they carry, internally, a weight that has no name in the world they're living in. This is not a defense of what Lyle and Erik Menendez did. 2 people were killed. Kitty Menendez, whatever her failures, whatever her silences, was also a victim in ways this case never fully reckoned with. The killing of a parent, regardless of what that parent did, is not justice. But the Menendez case asks us to sit with a harder question. What do we do with a story that has no clean villains and no clean victims? What do we do when the person who committed the crime was also, for years before it, a person to whom a crime was being committed? There is no comfortable answer. And perhaps that is exactly why this case has never let go of us. The Menendez case is now more than 3 decades old. And it is still, in 2025, unresolved not legally but morally. New generations are encountering it for the first time through documentaries, through limited series, through podcasts and YouTube channels and social media threads. And every new generation lands in the same place, uncertain, because the easy version of the story, 2 greedy sons, a $14 million inheritance, a cold-blooded crime, is satisfying in the way that simple stories always are. But the complicated version, 2 boys, years of hidden trauma, a house where the most powerful person was also the most dangerous, is something else entirely. It is a story about what happens when the systems designed to protect children fail completely. When wealth insulates abuse from accountability. When the image of a family is so perfectly constructed that no one on the outside thinks to ask what is happening on the inside. The police were looking for a motive in the bank accounts. They were looking in the wrong place. The motive was written in years of silence. And the tragedy of the Menendez case, the real tragedy beneath all the headlines, is that by the time that silence was finally broken, the only way anyone was listening was because 2 people were already dead. Lyle and Erik Menendez remain, as of this recording, in custody, awaiting a final decision on their possible release. Whatever that decision is, this case will not stop asking questions. About family, about power, about the difference between a motive and a reason. About how long a secret can live inside a house before the house itself becomes the crime scene. I want to know what you think. Do you believe the brothers? Does it change how you see what they did? Leave your thoughts in the comments.